In this video, we are going to review the fill in the blanks for the agreement of sale for Delaware residential property. Notice that internally this document refers to these as sections, but you will also hear them called as paragraphs. You'll see other documents that refer to these as paragraphs and also sections, and you'll also see those documents internally call these paragraphs. So paragraphs and sections are one and the same. So Section 1, parties. Seller, seller's address, buyer, buyer's address. Presumably you know your buyer's address and their name, of course, but you'll need to go to the multiple listing service in order to know if the person lives in the property or not. So you'll scroll down, you'll see the hyperlink to the tax ID, which you'll also need to copy and paste into the agreement. So you'll copy and paste that. But for now, we're just looking for the address for the seller. So it looks like they still live in the property. Sometimes if they've moved out, it will list another address. Maybe it's always been a rental, so it'll have another address. If this is not their current address, the seller can then update it on the agreement of sale. The next thing you'll want after you've copied the tax parcel that you got from the MLS is the county. So you'll go back to the listing and you can do Command Find and you'll see Newcastle County. And then of course the property address goes into this third line here. So tax parcel, county, and then the address. That's in section 2. In section 3, we'll need to include the purchase price and then either 1 or 2 deposits. You could do a deposit upon signing the agreement. I recommend to do one within 3 to 5 days of acceptance. And then if you're going to do a second deposit, do it around day 21 to coincide with the end of your 3 inspection periods. So obviously, you'll put in the purchase price in this top line here, and then you'll put in the due date of that first deposit. So 3 days I'll put here, and then I'll put whatever I want to make as the first and or only deposit. Typically, we'd like to see these deposits at least $5,000 or 1 to 3% of the purchase price, depending on who you represent. And then, again, the second deposit, maybe day 21. Inclusions and exclusions. So you will find this checklist also in the seller's property disclosure on page 6. So you'll want to make sure, number 1, that these items are checked correctly. Sometimes people will put in refrigerators additional, but it's actually the kitchen refrigerator. Or they'll exclude shades or blinds, and that doesn't really make sense. So number 1, you want to see what they put yes and no here for. Copy what makes sense. If the buyer doesn't want something that is included, they can check no on their agreement. And if there's something that is not included that they'd like included, like let's say they're not including window AC units, but the buyer would like them, then you check yes. So you just want to be consistent with the seller's property disclosure, because if you're not, it's not included in the agreement unless it's included here on the actual agreement of sale. If there's any additional property that would normally be excluded and the buyer wants, put it right here in the additional inclusion. So that might be patio furniture or something that's freestanding that is not already listed above that the buyer does want. And of course, the buyer will initial the bottom of every page. The seller will also initial the bottom of every page once they're in agreement with the terms. Section 4 continues, so additional exclusions. So if there's something that is normally included that's a fixture that the buyer does not want, they would indicate it here. So for example, a flat screen TV is not included automatically. It is personal property. But the wall mounts on which it sits is. And if let's say the seller's taking their TV and you don't want the wall mount, then you can say, flat screen TV and living room wall mount is excluded. And then you might say, seller to patch paint repair wall after removal. So any repairs that might be needed from removing a fixture, you'll indicate there. So you'll want to indicate whether or not the property is leased by a tenant or subject to third-party leases like a propane tank or something like that, or a security alarm system. So you'll want to go to the seller's disclosure and then just go to find lease. Is this property encumbered by a lease? That's in question 2. And let's see if the property is leased. That's not applicable for our purposes here. This question is to figure out if the property is a fee simple property, how it's owned. Okay, so water treatment system. So if there is one, whether it's leased or owned. So that's important to note. And again, these inclusions, exclusions also indicate whether something is leased or owned. So that way you can say yes or no as appropriate. Section 6, financing. So if the buyer is going to pay cash for the property, they're going to select no. Or they might get a mortgage, but they have assets sufficient to show they can cover the purchase price and or closing costs with the amount of money in their bank. So let's say the property were going to cost $360 inclusive of closing costs, and they have $400,000 in the bank. They can disclose that they have $400,000. They could say no, they're not obtaining financing, or at least it's not party to the agreement or a contingency. They would only need to do that if they were competing with other buyers and wanted to indicate, hey, we'll buy the property no matter what. And you might seek financing, but you're not able to terminate if you don't get the financing or if the property doesn't appraise. If the buyer is getting financing and they cannot show sufficient assets to cover the closing costs and purchase price, then they would select yes. And they would indicate the type of financing, the term, the loan amount, and the loan to value. So typical financing is conventional, FHA, VA, USDA. And then typical term in years is 30 years. Sometimes people go for a 15-year mortgage, 20, 25, but 9 times out of 10, you're going to see 30. I'm going to talk about maximum loan to value ratio. So if somebody tells you I'm putting 20% down, their loan to value is the inverse of that. So it's 80% of the loan. So whatever down payment is, you do 100 minus the down payment. So if their down payment's 5%, you do 100 minus 5, 95% is their loan to value. And then to get the loan amount, you multiply the sales price by point and then whatever the loan to value is. So if they're putting 5% down, the loan to value is 95%, you'd do the sales price times 0.95, and that would give you the loan amount. Or if they're putting 20% down, that would be the sales price times 0.8, because 80% is the loan to value, and that would go in the loan amount. The commitment date is the date by which we're asking the lender to approve of the property through the appraisal process and approve of the buyer's documentation also through the underwriting process. Both go through the underwriting process, but this is the date by which we are asking the lender to commit the funds for the purchase. Typically, buyers and lenders do not need more than 30 days to get this done, so you can put in 30 days. Make note, though, if it takes a week or more to negotiate the agreement, you might need to move this date out a week to accommodate for the lost time. And then this date here indicates the date by which the buyer needs to apply for the loan. So 5 to 7 days should be sufficient to make sure that the buyer closes on time within 30 or more days. Again, buyer initials at the bottom, and then if seller agrees, they'll initial at the bottom as well. Section 7, settlement. So pick the county in which you will close. So that might be your office, so pick your county office, or they might be settling at the settlement attorney's office, so whichever county they're in, regardless of where the property is. Ideally, they're one and the same, but not necessarily. And then you put the date on which the buyer would like ownership of the property. That means they'll get keys to the property, it will be empty, it'll be broom clean, and they could technically move in that day. I always recommend do not have the moving truck lined up for the day of closing or even within a few days of closing, maybe a week later. That way you can make sure that if there are any delays, you don't end up with homeless underwear. Section 9, conveyance. So this is where you fill in the ownership type of the property, whether it's fee simple, co-op, or leasehold subject to annual ground rent. And if it's leasehold, you'd put in the ground rent there. Most likely it's going to be in fee simple, and you can just type in fee simple and it will take you to line 22 and you can see if it's fee simple on the disclosure for the property in question. Okay, so broker's notice and disbursement process based on passage of time. So if there's a dispute over whether or not the buyer defaulted on the terms of the agreement or the seller defaulted, the party who believes the other party defaulted would have to make a claim within X days before the broker can decide to release the funds. So make this date 7 to 14 days. So that way the party who believes the other party's in default has only 7 to 14 days to make a claim. Because otherwise, if you're on the buy side and this is 180 days, it might be 6 months before they can request their money back, or the broker decides, well, we're going to give the money back to the buyer because we believe they're correct. And then there's a 60-day notice period. And then now it's 8 months before the buyer could even potentially see any money back. You want this date to be short so that way people who are wronged take action quickly. Again, buyer initials, and if seller agrees, they'll initial there. Section 11, transfer taxes, prorations, heating fuel. So seller and buyer shall pay for deed preparation. So you'll have to pick which one. It's only $75, so it really is not a huge deal who pays. Again, buyer initials and then the seller initials if they agree. So if the property is a single-family house, whether attached or detached, whether it has a basement or not, you will want to do the wood-destroying insect inspection report. And based on how long you're doing the home inspection period for, or if you're doing any of the sewer or septic, you may make this date coincide with the 15 days that you are doing for the home inspection. Or if you make the septic or well inspection 30 days out, you might make this also 30 days out. Do notice though that it's a date, not a day number. So if, let's say, I wanted this to coincide with my home inspection, which I'm going to make 15 days out, I might make this a date that's 21 days into the future. Since today is August 2nd, if I want to make sure that I have at least 15 days to do this, I'm going to make this date the 23rd of August. And that way, if it takes up to a week for us to negotiate this agreement, I at least have a full 2 weeks before I need to hand this over to the seller if treatment or damages are noted. Again, buyer initials at the bottom, and if seller agrees, they initial at the bottom. Section 21, home inspection contingency. So there are actually 5 dates, 3 of which you might change. So 15 days is the default for the home inspection for the buyer to do their due diligence. Contractually, their obligation is to give the seller the opportunity to correct any defects on the property. So they have 15 days to present the seller a written request. And then the seller, the default is they have 7 days for a response. So the seller's response period is a default of 7 days. You might want to just shorten that to about 3 days because there's still another 3-day by default period for written negotiations to go back and forth between buyer and seller. Now, the other date is found down here, such that if the seller does not agree to everything that the buyer has requested, the buyer has 1 day after the written negotiations period to decide if they want to buy the house with the seller's offer or terminate and get their deposit back. Another date in here is that if repairs are recommended or agreed to, written proof of completion shall be supplied to buyers at least 2 days prior to settlement. So the way that is counted is the day of settlement is not included, and you need 2 full days between settlement and the day that the deadline is. So if it's a Wednesday closing, Wednesday doesn't count. So you need Tuesday and Monday as 2 full days. So Sunday at midnight becomes a deadline by which the written proof of completion and the repairs have to be completed by. There's also a pre-settlement walkthrough or inspection that the buyer does within 48 hours of the closing. So that way, that would be, let's say for Wednesday 9 a.m. closing, that would be Monday at 9 a.m. And just so you see where it is in the contract, that 48-hour deadline after which you need to do that pre-settlement inspection is right here in paragraph 19, condition of the property. So just to summarize, use the default of 15 days to do the inspections, unless you're competing with another buyer and you want to sweeten this and make it 10 days or a shorter time frame, for the buyer to do all their due diligence on the home inspection. And then shorten the 7-day period to 3 days for the seller's response, and then another 3 days for written negotiations. And then as you saw at the bottom, later in the section, the buyer has 1 day to decide if everything isn't agreed to, whether or not to buy the property or not. Note that as soon as the seller agrees to everything that the buyer has asked for, if they agree in the seller's response, then there is no negotiations. The buyer bought the property. Another deadline in here that is worth mentioning is that let's say the seller does not respond. Well, then the buyer has 10 days from this request date to decide if they want the property or not. So in effect, it adds up the default 7 days and 3 days to make it a 10-day full period for the buyer to determine if they want the property or not. Presumably that's so they can get estimates for the repairs to be done and decide if it's financially feasible for them to buy the property. If there are other structures that are not considered the attached or detached garage or improvements attached to the house or garage, then you want to include them here. So in one of our example properties, there's a horse stable, there's a carport, which may or may not be covered by garage, and then there's also 3 sheds. So any other structure that would be included that you want inspected by the home inspector, you want to write it in here. And again, buyer initials at the bottom, and if seller agrees, they initial at the bottom. Every owner of a septic tank is required to do a Class F pumping of the septic tank and a Class H inspection of the tank every 36 months. So that's a state requirement by DNREC, D-N-R-E-C. So the seller, by default, has 21 days to provide that to the buyer. Presumably, if they have already done it within the last 36 months, they can provide it much more quickly. So you want to shorten that time frame. If there's a septic tank, you may decide to automatically say yes and give yourself that 30-day window in which you can receive the report and then decide to conduct your own pumping and inspection. So if, let's say, the seller has already done the septic within the last 36 months, maybe you ask for this report in 3 days, 5 days, and then based on what that report says, then you can decide whether or not to proceed with ordering your own septic inspection. Now, if, let's say, the seller gives you this report and everything on it looks great, it's moderately recent, you can just not do this inspection. Basically, by letting this time frame go by and doing nothing is you're accepting the property. You're waiving your right to do that inspection, and it's no harm, no foul. You can just do that. If, for example, though, something on the report was labeled to be monitored, or you noticed maybe a brown liquidy substance near the septic tank, you might want to actually make sure you do this inspection on your own anyway. And especially if the report is maybe 30 months or older, you're going to have to do it in the next 6 months. So you might as well do it now to make it part of the agreement of sale and something that's negotiable. Now, the well water contingency, if you're going to do these, just make them all the 30 days out. So if it's going to take you up to a week to negotiate the well water, maybe you use a date that's 37 days out. It might be actually a 2 to 3 week turnaround for the well water test. So maybe 30 days out is sufficient. Just pick a date. You can even call the well water inspection companies before you make the offer to see what their timeframes are. So at the very least, make this a date 21 to 30 days out. Radon is really quick and easy. That can be turned around in a matter of days to get them out to the property. Then there's a test that takes about 72 hours to get the results back. Since there are these other tests, you can just make them the same 21 to 30 days that you would do and have all of these deadlines fall in line with each other. That way you don't have a million deadlines to worry about. They're the home inspection deadlines and then the other inspections and termite deadlines, so that you only have like 2 sets of deadlines in essence. So the well water test, obviously if the property has well water, you'll want to do it. You might also want to have an additional inspection to test the pressure because that's not automatically included here. And then as far as the swimming pool contingency, we'll talk about it more in a separate video, but if it's the off season, the buyer may also have to pay to have the pool closed again after the inspection. So you might want to write that provision in so that the seller understands that. Radon typically accumulates in the basement, and then by the time it gets to the first floor, it dissipates. Again, buyer initials at the bottom and seller initials if they agree. So, agency disclosure. It's important to know who's representing whom, and for the buyers and sellers to know if the broker is representing both parties or if there are separate brokers representing each party, and if the agents are in the same brokerage or if the agents are not in the same brokerage or if the agent's the same person. So first start by filling out the listing broker in the first line and the listing agent, and then fill out your broker if you're the buyer's agent or the selling broker, and then fill out the selling agent, so that's you if you're the buyer's agent. Ignore seller's sub-agent, just ignore that. Ask yourself, are the listing brokers the same? If they're the same, you pick dual agent and dual agent. If they're different, then you pick seller's agent and buyer's agent. Then, with regard to the listing agents, ask, am I the same? Am I the same person for each? So if you are representing the buyer and the seller, then you're the designated dual agent and the designated dual agent. So if you represent both parties, your broker also represents both parties, and you'd select these 4 boxes. If the listing broker and the buyer's broker are different, and presumably you don't work at 2 brokerages, I don't think it's possible, then you'd pick seller's designated agent and buyer's designated agent. So you'd pick these. So in effect, 2 separate brokerages, 2 separate agents, you pick all the ones on the left. If it's the same broker and the same agent, you pick all the ones right down the middle. Now, if you are in the same brokerage and you pick dual agent and dual agent, then if there's another agent in your office, presumably representing the other party, then you pick designated agent and designated agent. Again, buyer initials at the bottom, and then seller, if they agree, initials there. And then Section 31, Addenda, seller's disclosure of real property condition report, unless exempt by state law, additional form required. So every buyer should say yes to this, because either there's a seller's disclosure or an exemption form that's attached. So you want to say yes to make sure that that is included in the agreement of sale. If you write in no or leave it blank, you're waiving your opportunity to include that as a contingency or a clause. Customarily, the buyer is not going to be penalized if you don't put yes here, but best practices is to mark it yes. You don't want to be the one agent whose client misses an opportunity to get a seller assist because you forgot to select yes for the FHA or VA amendatory clause, or you forgot to say yes for the seller's contribution addendum. So be meticulous in saying yes to these documents that you want to include in the agreement of sale. So yes for seller's disclosure, and everybody, whether the party is exempt or not from filling out the seller's disclosure, which includes like banks who are selling foreclosed properties or executors or administrators who are handling estates, everybody's required for the lead and the radon disclosures to be filled out. So you'll say yes and yes. Decoya resale cert or contingency addendum, that is for condos only, or for where there's an HOA, a homeowners association, like a planned unit development. So you'll find that on the seller's property disclosure, whether or not if it's part of a condo. So is the property part of a condo or other common ownership? If number 10 is, if they say yes, number 11, they say homeowners or condo association or maintenance corporation, then you'd want to include yes there. Civic association may not require dues, so I would just double check if that would constitute as needing the Decoya resale cert or the contingency addendum. I don't believe they do, though. If you have an investor who's selling a property through a tax-deferred 1031 exchange and buying this property as part of that, then you'll want to include the tax-deferred 1031 exchange doc. If you are on the seller's side and they are selling this property, it has to be an investment property, and buying another investment property, then you'd also want to include that tax-deferred exchange document here. Buyer's financial information, so no matter what, whether buying cash or finance deals, you'll want to include the buyer's financial information. I would suggest always include the closing cost estimate. That way the listing agent sees what is needed for the down payment and closing costs. And then include proof of funds, so maybe a bank statement or a bank letter stating or showing that you have enough funds, the buyer has enough funds to cover those costs. So if the buyer's bank account is sufficient and not too much higher than what the buyer needs, then maybe you just show that. But if, let's say, the buyer's financial statement shows that they have $100,000 in the bank, but they only need 50, maybe you get the banker to write a letter on their letterhead stating that they have 50,000 or more for the purchase. Now, if you're doing a finance deal, include a mortgage letter with credit check. So that means that you're getting a pre-approval from the lender, not a pre-qualification, but a pre-approval where they've actually run the credit on the buyer and they verified funds and they've run the buyer's documentation through their initial underwriting software. So that you'll include the mortgage letter with credit check. FHA, a mandatory language, and for your protection, get a home inspection. So those are 2 different forms that you would provide and include if you have a buyer who's doing FHA. That would include whether or not there's a seller assist, which is basically money off the sales price that is going to cover the buyer's third-party expenses at closing, and the buyer is financing it over 30 years. So that's really important if they're getting a seller assist to attach the FHA mandatory language document if they're doing an FHA loan. If they're doing a VA loan, then attach the VA mandatory language form. If they're doing conventional financing and getting a seller assist, check off yes for additional addenda, and then write in seller contribution addendum number 1 and include that because it'll state what the seller assist amount is. If the seller is providing a home warranty or the buyer is requesting that the seller pay for a home warranty, say yes there, and then write in the seller's paying, or if the buyer's paying, and then the warranty company name. And you might even include, well, the policy is included as an attached document, so it will show the plan, but maybe you want to include the name of the plan so it's very clear what plan you're asking the seller to pay for if you're asking the seller to pay. And then additional addenda not included. There's plenty of other forms that you may or may not want to include. So if you're including any, write yes, write the name to the right. If you're including 2 or more, say yes, and then write the second one down here, comma, and the third one, comma, or as many as you need to write in. Additional terms and conditions. So if the buyer, let's say, is a VA buyer and you want to make it explicit that the seller pays for the termite certification, which is required and is also stated in the VA mandatory language, but sometimes sellers don't read everything. If you want to be clear, you can write in, seller to provide buyer with clean termite certification 2 days prior to closing, something like that. It is not advised to write in additional terms and conditions where forms exist that state exactly what you need. If you do need to write additional language, have the attorney doing the title work review that language before including it in the agreement of sale. We are not attorneys. We are not trained to think about all the what ifs, and we don't typically write language that is clear, that will truly protect our client in the off chance that that clause language is needed to prevent a dispute from happening. Section 34, changes. So if you change something that's pre-printed in the form, for example, you write in that any repairs that are done need to be done 5 days prior to closing, not 2 days prior to closing. You'd check off yes, you'd indicate the section number, and then you'd write in 2 days changed to 5 days. Final acceptance, so the buyer is going to sign, date, and put the time of their signature. If they do .loop or DocuSign, it should automatically show you the time. And then if the seller agrees, they're going to sign, and they're also going to date and time the agreement. Now, if you're the listing agent and you're receiving this, put the effective ratification date as of the date that the seller is signing off on the agreement. You're going to send this back immediately to the buyer's agent. If, let's say, you cannot send it back immediately to the buyer's agent, you can text them and say, hey, the agreement is signed. I can't get it back to you until later today or tomorrow morning. But your notice via text or email or verbally telling the buyer's agent that it is signed makes this contract binding to the buyer and the seller. And whether or not you send it back, it is still binding. That notice that you gave to the other side makes it binding. But what's important about this effective ratification date is that it is considered day 0 of the contract. And any dates or deadlines that go by day 3, by day 5, by day 15, those are all counted from the day after ratification. So if the buyer signs on August 1st, the seller signs on August 2nd, and you as the listing agent put August 2nd as the ratification date, that's day 0, and August 3rd becomes day 1. If, let's say, you're the listing agent and you leave this blank, and the buyer signs on August 1st, the seller signs on August 2nd, and you send it back on August 3rd, even if you gave notice or not, as the buyer's agent, I could write in August 3rd, because that's when I received it and it was blank, and August 3rd becomes day 0, and the next day, August 4th, is day 1. So basically, I get an extra day by virtue of that being blank. So whoever writes the date in controls the time clock for the transaction. And regardless of whatever that date is and whichever side you're on, always prepare a timeline of the dates that you understand are the deadlines of the contract. So that way it's a lot more clear when you get up against those deadlines that you're terminating legally, because your job as the buyer's agent is to protect the buyer's deposits so that you terminate legally if you need to. And your goal and job as the listing agent is to make it really clear if the buyer defaults that they're in default. So always, always, always make sure you're in agreement with the other party as to the dates and deadlines of the contract. Last page of the agreement of sale. So you will continue to fill in what's in green. So you'll fill in the listing broker's information, their company name and their code, the address and the brokerage license. You'll fill in the listing agent's name and their code, their license, their email, and then put the office and the mobile number of the brokerage and the agent. And then you'll put in your contact information if you're on the buyer side. So selling agent is the same thing as buyer's agent. So put in the brokerage, their code, the address, their license, your name, your MLS code, your license and your email, and then your office number and your mobile number. And those are found in the MLS listing. For whatever reason, sometimes this happens where the license is unknown, but if you click on her name, you can see her mobile phone, which is also listed on the prior page, and her email and her name and her company name. When you click onto this page, you're hoping that you'll see their license number if it's not already on the first page. But here's her subscriber ID. So you can also see her phone number's here, her subscriber ID is here, the name of her brokerage is here, their code is here, their address is right below, the office phone, again, her phone. And then the brokerage license number usually is when you click on it, you can see brokerage license is right there. Okay, so I color-coded these two sections in different color other than green because as the buyer's agent, if you are not physically in receipt of the first check, if it was due with the signing of the offer, do not fill this in. Let the listing agent fill in the amount that was received, check off check, and write the check number. Nobody's doing cash, so only check off check. Maybe the buyer wires the funds, so nobody would fill this out. You just use the wire receipt as the receipt that it's been received. Now, if the seller is just outright rejecting the buyer's offer and is not going to sign the agreement, then as a courtesy, have them put the date and time and sign that they're rejecting the offer and send it back to the buyer. That way, the buyer has confidence that you presented the agreement of sale to your client. So this is how you fill in the blank for your agreement of sale. Good luck.